Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome back to Visa Passion. And in this little bit of an international break, the penultimate one of the year before, the holiday breaks and whatnot, I took some time out to watch the it's not so new now, especially at the time of recording, Netflix documentary that focused on the Spain women's team and their road to their World Cup glory just last year in Australia and in New Zealand, which, yeah, it was a fun time for all. I have very good memories of that entire tournament. But this documentary, it focuses on all of the things that transpired before, during, and after the tournament. And if you're an avid follower, or just a passive follower to an extent, I guess, of women's football, you will know the story of Spain's triumph and everything that happened, including the RFEF, that is Spain's governing body of football within the nation, and of course their former leader slash president Luis Rubiales, their coach Jorge Vilda, and everything else in between. So I watched it and I just wanted to give my thoughts on the entire thing. I thought it was a very well made documentary, and there were definitely some eye opening revelations from many of the players, old and new, past and present as well. And I just want to give my thoughts on it. So, what I'm going to do in this video, I'm just going to give a rundown of everything that happened throughout the documentary and also just providing my thoughts as well. So, hopefully, this video isn't too long, but at the same time, if it is, it just means that there's a lot to go through, which, trust me, there is a lot to go through. So, with this long winded, nearly pretty much 2 minute introduction, let's get right into it. So, the basic layout of this documentary is told from the perspective of what I call the triumvirate or the Trinity. If you're a DC Comics fan, you know what I'm getting at. And the three main people who we see the story play out from is, of course, Jenny Hermoso, who was pretty much at the center of all the controversy in the aftermath of the World Cup victory for Spain. Alexia Putellas, who pretty much acts as a mother figure and as the leader of the entire Spanish team, which is something that you see throughout the entire documentary. And of course, Irina Paredes, the other national team captain and Real Madrid player. So it's really taken from the perspective of those three players in particular, and there's a lot of jumping back and forth during timelines to really give you an understanding of what it is that led to this moment and what the future may hold. So it can be a little bit hard to follow at times, so your attention is really required in order for you to get a good as possible understanding of everything that goes on. But speaking of the Trinity, and as the documentary begins, one thing that was very noticeable, especially when the players start to speak out, is Irina Paredes was very tense and uncomfortable. And I feel like that was very personified of the tension and the kind of worry that was emanating from all the players that took part, and by extension, all the players who were, reached out to take part in this documentary, because I'm pretty sure that they understood the consequences of them potentially taking part in such a thing like this, and it becomes more evident as to why they were so tense and uncomfortable as the story unravels. And as we go on into the documentary, there was a quote that stood out very much from the early on get-go of things, and that was from Ivan Andres, who said that the RAF stole it from us, and that was pretty much the glory of the World Cup. And that's, of course, considering all the nonsense that the national team had to put up with in the lead up to and the aftermath of it all. Because, of course, it's well documented just how much the Spanish women's team has suffered at the hands of the RFEF with regards to lack of proper facilities for training, lack of resources like food and transport, which is something that's touched on in the documentary, like how these players had to travel long distances, hours on hours, to play in a match and then do those long distances again, and it's insane, especially compared to the men's team, where the men's team, they jump onto jets and pretty much get everything on a silver platter for them. There's even a funny anecdote where it's revealed that the likes of Sergio Ramos and Gerard Piqué, they were pretty much bribed to come back to the national team by Luis Rubiales, and it wasn't like a bribe to say, "Oh, I'll pay you like extra," but they actually got Rolex watches. Like they demanded Rolex watches, and Rubiales was like, "Sure." So it shows you the standards and the perceptions that the women's team have in comparison to the men's team. So it tells you a lot. And the RFEF, they are not covered in any type of glory in this entire documentary because, again, early on, we are told that they pretty much harassed Jenny Hermoso in the aftermath of the kiss from Luis Rubiales. They managed to, I guess, brainwash, um, take control of one of Hermoso's friends, and they tried to use him as a Trojan horse to get her to essentially like forget about everything that happened, which was really sad to see. Um, you really can't help but to feel sorry for Hermoso in that kind of a scenario because this is someone who she's been friends with for a long time. A little money gets shown his way, and he pretty much, allows for the friendship to erode just for a little bit of that dollar bill, and it's a shame. It's a shame, really. And speaking of the kiss, it doesn't take a genius to realize that it overshadowed everything. Obviously, in the moment, it didn't mean much because of the euphoria that was just going round and round the team and whatnot. But it was a specter that did eventually rear its ugly head in the immediate aftermath. And of course, if you've been following what happened in the aftermath of that, it's been a lot, and it's a shame, really. And it's just amazes me personally how quickly everything just descended upon the women's team and how quickly they were besieged upon by their own federation. Because apart from Hermoso's friend, who pretty much went out of his way to call her out, calling her despicable and hoping the worst for her, there was already the issue of there being a lot of division amongst the squad because if you noticed, the squad that went to the World Cup, it was a real hodgepodge of players, old and new, which is an entirely new kind of worms that needs to be opened here, of which we're going to definitely open it up here because there was a lot of division because again there was a mix of old and new, and the older heads, because of everything that they'd gone through before under the previous management before Jorge Vilda, as well as their strike in the lead up to the World Cup, you know, they felt quite slighted with how they were treated by the federation. And of course, you get the newer players who see this as a major opportunity to represent their country. And it was a situation where I guess in the defense of the newer players, they didn't think an opportunity like this would come knocking twice. And you know, national pride and whatnot, it goes a long way. And I guess because they never had that kind of exposure, they wouldn't know. But also, you have to call into question the issue of quote unquote loyalty, you know, to your fellow players and whatnot, which is something we'll touch on just a little bit later in this video. But that issue of like the old heads and the new heads, it really came to a boil, particularly through Ivana Andres, who was one of the newer players, and she was nominated captain by Jorge Vilda despite having pretty much next to no international senior caps beforehand, you know, because she was considered a Vilda ally, in spite of there being the leadership core in Paredes, Hermoso, and Puteas, because again, she was made captain, so she pretty much stood out as an enemy of the cause. So it didn't look too good for her, and I'm sure she didn't feel good about it. I'm sure in her mind she didn't even see things that way. She was just happy at the opportunity that she was given, and you know, as a result, Andres, she felt a lot of imposter syndrome, which she does mention in the documentary, and it was a tough spot for her to be in, and nobody can really envy her in that kind of situation. And I really do feel sorry for her, if I'm being honest, because even if she was quote unquote a Vilda ally, it was very hard for her to try and really show her allyship towards him because now she would have to face off her fellow teammates in the dressing room. And imagine if they reject her, that's not going to bode well for her. And, you know, if it was someone else in her shoes apart from the trinity of Formosa Puteas and Paredes, I'm pretty sure things would have been pretty much the same. But, it was an unfortunate situation for her to find herself in, and I really do sympathize with her. She didn't ask for this, she just happened to be in, I guess, the right place at the right time, and fortune favored her, I guess you could say. But yeah, it's one of those things where she had to deal with it. And speaking of the coaching, Jorge Vilda, I've talked about this in some of the videos I made on the World Cup whenever Spain played. He's horrible. Like, not only as a person but as a coach, he's just awful. Even the stuff that he's doing now with Morocco, I feel like Morocco have taken like 2-3 steps back just by appointing him, and it shows in their results. And Vilda himself, he's a horrible coach. And this is just from like what I was seeing at the World Cup. At the World Cup, you could tell that the players were pretty much running the show without him being available or having any sense of input. Even though he took the credit for it because when in Rome, I guess. And this is pretty much backed up by Irina Paredes, who says it was common for him to not have any solutions. And this was on the back of Spain's humbling defeat to Japan, you know. And Paredes was saying that, like, she went to him saying, like, what do we do? We're getting clobbered. But Hilda had no solutions. And as we know, Spain got trounced 4-0 by Japan. And it was quite the drubbing. So that just is exemplary of Vilda's ineptitude as a coach, which is something that again gets touched on later on in the documentary. And it was just horrible, and that just goes to show you the kind of coach that the team were dealing with here. And that was pretty much a symptom of the overall problem, which was the RFEF, because according to former keeper Sandra Paños, who used to play for Barcelona and of course the Spain women's national team, she said that they were lacking committed people and structure from the RFEF, which led to all of the differences that I talked about earlier between the men's team and the women's team. From giving gifts of Rolex watches to the likes of Piqué and Ramos and being extorted happily, whereas the women could ask for just 3 square meals a day, and it was seen as a slap to the face, as if they're rebelling against the system. And the story goes on. It's pretty much self-explanatory. They just wanted to be treated with decency, but there was none of that. And it goes back. It is pretty much part of the fabric of the RFEF to disrespect their players, because we get a recall from Paredes where during her early days in the Spain national teams, their former coach Quereda, who was well known to be physically and emotionally abusive to the players, from leveling homophobic insults to them to like actually, assaulting them. Not like, fight club type things, but, nevertheless, assault, of which in a professional environment, that's uncalled for. And for any other team, it would have been called out. If it happened in England, it would have been immediately called out. If it happened in the US, it would have been immediately called out. And it would be pretty much unheard of in the men's teams. But this was the situation that Spain found themselves in, and it's just horrible, everything that's documented in this documentary, it just tells you more. I'm not going to go into detail about every last little nitty gritty. I would recommend highly that you go out and see it. It's on Netflix, of course. Obviously, it's in Spanish, but the subtitles are there and they're pretty good. But wow, it's a mess. The entire situation that these players had to go through, from Vilda pretty much being a creep telling players to keep your doors open at night in the hotel so I can come see you. It was just creepy, and obviously then came the watershed moment of the initial reports of the players asking for decency, but the RFEF played it out to the tabloids and the newspapers that are cozied up with them as if, Paredes, Hermoso, and Bates, the Trinity, were trying to, I guess, usurp the authority of the RFEF, and they did everything they could to paint the Trinity as villains, you know. And in the lead up to the World Cup, this was like a year before the World Cup, and I remember seeing so much of the backlash online. And initially, just like from a personal point of view, like I was going to be part of the people who were, you know, going up against the players. Because I was like, why would they complain? Aren't they being given everything? Because I was under the assumption that there's a level of parity when it came to national teams. But then like when I did my own digging and investigation, I was like, whoa, these guys aren't even giving these players like meals, or training equipment or transport. That's when I was like, no, these women are very much justified to ask for the things that they're asking for. They're not asking to be given first class tickets or whatever, or private jets, or performance-based bonuses. They're just asking for the basic things that you need as a player to perform at the highest possible level, like the things that we as fans, we just assume naturally are readily available to the players, of which in this case they weren't. And it was a shame to see these things happening, because you'd have thought that, okay, surely a nation that is very successful in football and very rich in terms of football finances like Spain could provide those things, but obviously they chose not to, because I guess the money was going into the pockets of Piqué and Ramos, for example. But that's not for me to decide, but you can pretty much put the dots together, you can connect them. And obviously with all these negative things being put out by the press and whatnot, it all came to a head in the infamous meeting which took place around 11 months before the World Cup. And pretty much prior to this meeting happening, there was a collective agreement by the players that we're all in this together, right? No matter what happens, despite what the news is saying, despite what people are saying on social media, we all have each other's backs. And it came down to this meeting where that pretty much was a lie, the stone-faced lie, because the true colors were shown in this meeting. Because according to the players who gave their testimonials about that, Vilda pretty much cornered all the players, and he just showed a lack of support to the older players, the seasoned veterans, and he pretty much asked the players like, who wants to play for Spain, and all that, that kind of rah-rah speech. And of course, like the newer players, because they didn't know if they would ever get another chance at these things, so they understood the politics behind this, they obviously, stood on the side of Vilda, and by extension the RFEF, not because they wanted to, but simply because they were looking at their own legacies. And of course, that did stir up some, let's just say, animosity, for lack of better words, between the older players and the newer players, of which this was pretty much exemplified through the relationship between Aitana Bonmati and Laia Godina, where it was pretty much insinuated, but you could tell from what was being said and what was being shown at the same time in the documentary, that these two, they had a very strong bond whilst they were playing for Barcelona. But considering that Bonmati had been on the side of the older heads, whereas Godina was called up as one of the newer players, Godina did not, stand for the older players, and I guess Aitana took it to heart, and that pretty much saw the end of their relationship. And that's something that really hurt Godina, which she does mention and go into detail about in the documentary. But it shows the kind of situation that these players were under. you know, as a newer player, are you really going to say to yourself, I'm going to willingly reject my first cap for my national team so that I can stand solidarity with my club players, my friends, and whatnot? It's a hard situation to find yourself in. It's a hard choice to make. You're stuck in between a rock and a hard place because you can understand both sides of the coin. Yes, stand with the players. You know of the abuse that's going on, but at the same time, you want to carve your own legacy. You want to have that privilege of knowing that I represented my national team at the highest level, and I don't I don't disagree or agree with either of the stances that were taken by both sets of players in terms of this situation, like personified obviously through Bonmati and Godina, where because of Godina's choice, Bonmati just severed their friendship that had been forged over years. Whereas for Godina, she's saying to herself, like, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity I may never get again. You know, I want to take it because of so many opportunities that open up as a result of it. You know, I I understand both sides of the argument, and I don't think necessarily there is a hero or a villain in these kinds of situations, but we'll return to this later. Just keep this in mind for now, because as you will see as we get back to the World Cup that just happened, there was a lot that eventually transpired that makes you question some of the decisions that were taken. So, anyway, moving on from the meeting, we then get a situation where, in the lead up, this is just the newer players that are playing in the international friendlies and whatnot. And all of a sudden, last year in January, Guterres decides to call for a meeting with Rubiales to negotiate a return for the 15, of which the 15, if you don't know, they are the 15 players who sent out that letter that got them pretty much killed in the media and online, and of which the Trinity were in there, Bonmati was in there, etc., etc. And pretty much these players are the ones who said, we're not going to want to be called up. If you call us up, we're not coming. The one where it stirred up a whole lot of issues like, oh, how can these players do it? National pride, blah, blah, blah. But for obvious reasons that I've already mentioned, we all know why they didn't accept the call to participate. But anyway, back to Puteas, and she negotiated with Rubiales the return of these players. And I guess because the World Cup was coming up, Rubiales agreed not only for those 15 players to come back, but also agreed some of the concessions that Puteas had requested, like getting good coaching sessions, getting access to equipment and other resources like nutrition plans and so on and so forth. And just to top it all off, the additional, I guess, benefit of having their families travel with them to Australia and New Zealand pro bono. So like Spain would cover that from accommodation and I guess allowances and whatnot. The families would be allowed to travel with the players. And Puteas' motivation at that point of time was that these players who had sat out the 15, they had nothing to lose because everybody was just upset about the entire situation, both the older players and the newer players. So she just figured it's just best to try and make the best out of this situation, try and make chicken salad or chicken shit and whatnot. And it pretty much worked, like things got better. The players returned, well, the ones that at least got called up by Vilda, because the likes of Panos, she was never called back up, even though she opened herself back up for contention. So she missed out on what ended up being a triumphant World Cup for Spain. But of course, the likes of Puteas, Hermoso, Paredes, as well as Bonmati and co, they got called up to the World Cup, and the rest is history. Obviously, Spain go and win the whole thing, and it was mentioned in the documentary that, funny enough, this was the first time that Rubiales in particular was present at a tournament for the women. He wasn't there for the Euros before and the other tournaments prior, but he came to this one, and it was pretty surprising, but at the same time not very much surprising, all things considered, because when you think about it, he pretty much only turned up, I'm pretty sure he turned up at the end when he saw that, like, holy crap, the women are actually doing something here. I need to go and show face. And I'm not surprised because in the end, when they captured the glory, he was there. He was having a ball of a time, and this is pretty much exemplified in like a beautiful montage from around the 50-minute mark to the 52-minute mark, 2 minutes, and it's like a very beautiful montage. After Spain had qualified for the final, and it shows like how they got there from the match with the Netherlands and so on and so forth. It shows the players just being so jovial, so happy, celebrating their final berth, and then boom, the music just goes sour, and obviously you see Rubiales who comes in photobomb, no, well, not even just photobombs, but he just bombs on Salva Parojelo's interview post-match after the Netherlands game, and he conducts his own interview, obviously jovial himself because of what's happened. Um, he pretty much swears like a sailor during the interview, which I guess is something that's common in Spanish media. Uh, I don't know what the rules and standards of the media is there, but he was swearing like a sailor. And he pretty much ran with his own narrative where he just endorsed Filda. He tried to canonize him as a martyr for the cause, saying he was being vilified unjustly and so on and so forth. And he did it. He pretty much did his best to stomp on the players who were protesting, calling them liars and whatnot, defending his boy pretty much, which is crazy, all things considered, you know. And it's even worse when you realize that the players who didn't get called up, who pretty much helped on the way to get Spain to this level, the likes of Paños and Gallardo, who is a goalkeeper for Atletico Madrid, for them, it felt apparent when they had seen this interview and they had seen how far the team had come. They felt like they had done so much and contributed so much that for them to not be there with the others, it really hurt them. And I think for Paños in particular, her side of the story of the events that transpired at the World Cup really drive home how sad the entire situation is. Because she didn't watch the World Cup at all. That's her claim, and she said that she did send out emails and other lines of communication to the RFEF outlining her interest in representing Spain at the World Cup, but she received no communication back. They didn't even send her like a letter of acknowledgement saying, "Yeah, we received your email. We'll think about it." Like zero. So that shows you where her relationship, at least the RFEF and by extension the other members of the 15 who are now 8, were with the RFEF. And looking back on the final itself, it was evident that the entire nation, Spain that is, were highly motivated and inspired by what the women had gone through, because we see clips of people just going about watching the games, whether it's at the beach, in malls, at home, you name it, at bars even. The whole nation was behind them. And the win itself was just a groundswell of emotion, a roller coaster for everyone. Obviously, the players who were there, they couldn't believe it. They were very happy, of course. The emotions and the tensions and the thoughts that were running through the game against England, they were high. Anytime England was about to look like they were going to score, Codina recalls her being worried and saying like, "Oh my God, how am I going to deal with this, etc., etc." But obviously, come the final whistle, Spain were triumphant. And whilst the players who weren't called up were happy, Gallardo in particular, I think she exemplifies the emotions that were running throughout the rest of them and their sentiments, that they were happy at first, but then they asked themselves, "Why did you win?" Gallardo's direct quote is, "Why did you win, bitches?" Like, it tells you everything that was going on inside her mind. And I guess by extension, the other players when they called up, they were happy, but now they were like, what if? And unfortunately, that's something that's going to haunt them for the rest of their careers, given everything that's transpired beforehand and what's currently going on. And now we get to pretty much, I guess, the inspiration behind this entire podcast, and that's Louis, not podcast, but documentary, sorry. I guess this is also a podcast, but that's besides the point. And that is, of course, Luis Rubiales. And apart from the kiss, Rubiales was pretty much going out of his way to act like an ass because we see clips of him like lifting Atenea del Castillo up, and then you know him like just being very physical with some of the other players, and it was something that was pointed out by Olga Carmona, of course, the goal scorer in that final who got Spain the win. Like she pointed out that like he got too comfortable with all the players, and it just shows that he didn't care. I guess in that situation, I guess he was just happy about the attention that it was gonna get and everything in between. But Carmona really put it well that he got too comfortable, and that's shown not only from the way he behaved with the players, but also how he was celebrating from the stands. Because this is just so funny when I think about it and I watch the clip because they're in the documentary as well. But after the final whistle goes and Spain are pretty much confirmed as the winners, there's a moment between Vilda, who's on the pitch, and Rubiales, who's there by the VIP stands. Pretty much like something out of an anime where the evil villain and his minion triumph over the hero, I guess. They're busy applauding each other, giving each other thumbs up and whatnot. And then Rubiales goes out of his way to just like grab his crotch, And funny enough, when the camera zooms out from that moment, who is standing next to Rubiales but the Queen and Princess of Spain? And the lack of, I guess, foresight or wherewithal about where you are and your surroundings is funny enough on its own. But when you go out of your way to do that in front of, I guess, the rulers of your nation, and knowing that there's cameras around and that there's going to be cameras on you, I think it just shows what he thought, and also shows just the kind of person he is. Like, he doesn't care. He doesn't care. He's I guess, on top of the world. Because when you're doing that in front of, again, the Queen and Princess, the princess who looked like a teenager, like in her early teenage years, I'm sure she is. I didn't Google, but I'm sure she is. Yeah, it tells you. It tells you all you need to know. But anyway, moving on from that funny moment, of course, we get the infamous kiss. And during the celebrations on the pitch, and I guess going into the locker room, like the euphoria of the occasion, nobody really understands what's going on, because Hermoso highlights to the other 2/3 of the triumvirate that, hey, this guy, he kissed me. But like they didn't even understand what was going on. But funny enough, whilst the Spanish players were like celebrating and whatnot, and Hermoso like had told her other two members of the Trinity, like people picked it up on social media, and I remember I tweeted about it as well. Like, what the hell just happened here? Like, it was a massive thing that happened. Like, social media like noticed, and obviously the story blew up, and I guess Rubiales must have caught wind of it whilst he was in the celebrations, because Ivana Andres then points out that Rubiales was present in the locker room, and he was trying to make jokes about the entire situation, saying he's going to marry Hermoso and whatnot, and trying to pretty much make it seem like it was part of what had happened. And I guess some of the players believed him because they were all laughing about it in the bus, but Irina Paredes, she quickly put all the players into check and told them, like, no, what's happening here is actually something serious. Her words were, he kissed her because he feels superior to her. And of course, after that, the emotions like just cooled down a bit, and it was like a somber occasion. Like, it became bittersweet, and all of a sudden, I guess these were the informants in the team. that did this because there were some videos that were leaked of what was happening in the bus, to make it seem like everything is okay because it showed Hermoso laughing and whatnot. Because again, RFEF was doing their best to, play it down as they do. Um, but it took little time before the players got dragged to the dirt yet again. But I guess this time round, the players had learned from their previous mistakes when dealing with the RFEF and the power and the strength that they had with the media, just for example, because this time round, it just didn't work when it came to the media approach that the RFEF did, because now the world was watching, and because of what had been done on the football field, there was going to be even more groundswell of support, and this was pretty much shown through Amanda Gutierrez, who was, and I guess is at the moment, the president of FootPro, which is pretty much the players' union of FIFA, and she went about explaining how Hermoso was ruined because she came to her and told her what happened, and pretty much what was going on is that Hermoso was trying to get pressured. Well, not even trying, she was getting pressured by the RFEF to release a statement to support Rubiales and say, like, no, don't worry, nothing bad's going on. So Hermoso went to Gutierrez with all this information, and it pretty much became a situation whereby Gutierrez and Hermoso, who funny enough were on the same plane that was going back to Spain after the win, they tried to talk about what had happened to get more details so that they can come up with a solution to the problem. But she recalled, Gutierrez, that it was that any time the two of them would try to talk to one another, a member or two, well, according to her, 3 to 4 members of the RFEF, the officials that is, they would try to come close to hear what they were saying. So you can obviously see just from that alone that the RFEF, they knew what had happened and they knew what the implications potentially were. So they were trying to get ahead of the situation by, eavesdropping. But like I said, everyone had learned from the prior mistakes, and Hermoso was coy. So it did help out in the end, because in the aftermath of it all, you had Rubiales going on his apology tour, putting out an apology video like a Logan Paul would on YouTube and something, and it's just incredible how there was pretty much everyone running around the RFEF to help out Rubiales and make it seem like he didn't do anything wrong, but nobody came to Jenny's rescue or aid, which is something that Gutierrez points out in the documentary. And true enough, no one in the RFEF bothered to check up on her, to ask her side of the story. They just wanted her to release a statement to exonerate Rubiales of anything. And as a result, the ensuing plane ride was just awkward as hell. That is the agreement across the board for all the players, that it was just awkward, and it took the air hosts and air hostesses and the rest of the plane staff to just help out and just try to lift the spirits of the team, which did help, admittedly, and you can see in the footage that's shown on the documentary, the players did cheer up a bit, but seeing the awkwardness that was on the plane, you could tell that everybody was pretty much in agreement that something big had happened, and because something big had happened, it just felt weird to just be in a celebratory mood. And it does suck that such a massive achievement was marred by the actions of one man, because when you think about the story of Spain and just women's football in general, this is a major win on so many levels for women's football, but it just had to get overshadowed by this. And obviously, looking back at it, hindsight being 2020, it's good that it happened, because it meant that the women's team, at least the Spain national women's team, they get better treatment because of all these things. But at the same time, does such controversy have to occur for people to now start to pay attention to these things that happen, and at the same time for federations to start treating their players across the board with the basic decency you'd expect, you know. But that's besides the point. Um, Eventually, we do get the RFEF doing what they do, trying to rope in some of the newer players to try and um, help out Rubiales, getting them to release videos and make statements, say, "Oh no, he's a good guy" and whatnot. You know, the likes of Codina, Paredes, and Andreas, they were tapped trying to be coerced into doing videos, but thankfully none of them did. And RFEF tried to save face and do the whole thing about, oh, we're conducting internal investigation, etc., etc. But nothing came of it, because then they had the extraordinary general meeting where everybody expected Rubiales to resign, save face a little bit, because it was clear that nobody wanted him there. But that's when he did his little Wolf of Wall Street thing and said he wasn't going to retire. And in that moment, there was something interesting that I noted, even though it got rebutted by Arena Paredes just after it. But when he was saying he's not going, Rubiales that is, we get some camera shots of the members of the assembly obviously applauding him and whatnot. And obviously you get the sycophants going out of their way to really show their support for their boss, like Vilda, for example. And obviously one of Vilda's coaches, who's the current national women's team coach, Monse Tome, yes, she did applaud and whatnot, but I noticed that at least for her and some other members in that assembly, they pretty much took their time, I guess, to applaud him. Now, I don't know if that's a sign of defiance or they were in solidarity with the players, but they didn't want to look like they were standing out particularly. Um, but I don't know. That's just something interesting I noted. Obviously, like I said, Arena Paredes rebuffed what I had noted, because she mentioned that, oh, you'd see in the video the likes of Monse and Hilda, they were applauding him and whatnot. But anyway, that's up to you to decide when you watch the documentary. But I think it's telling personally. But then obviously after that assembly, Puteas decided, you know what, enough is enough. And she rallied the troops with the statement that she made that ended with, obviously with the hashtag Seasabo, Seakabo. I don't know how to say it. Anyway, my bad. It's one of those two, I promise for sure. And after that, it was pretty much curtains for Rubiales, because obviously the internet united across the world, from England to the US. Everyone pretty much came to the rescue, and we all know where the story ends. Everybody did everything that they could. The retired players who suffered under Quereda, the current players, like I said, players from other nationalities, other clubs around the world, they got together and they all just managed to do what they could, and eventually obviously led to the situation where Rubiales was kicked out. Obviously then went into hiding in a church, I guess, and whatnot. Like, that doesn't matter, those details. All we know is that he's gone. But obviously some of his cronies are still in there, in the RFEF, that is, which is a little bit concerning, and I guess something needs to be done about that in the near future, which hopefully it does get done. But yeah, like that's the crux of the documentary. Obviously, again, I do recommend that you go watch it. And at the very end, obviously there's a lot of positivity, as you would expect with such a documentary and the nature of it. But at the same time, again, with hindsight being 2020, we know that there hasn't been much progress in Spain when it comes to women's football. That's something that Bonmati herself has actually highlighted recently, that, despite the World Cup win, there's been next to no improvements in women's football in Spain. She pointed out rightfully so, actually, that when you look at women's football in England before and after England's Euros triumph, it's night and day. Whereas Spain have won a bigger prize and it's still the same. So, realistically speaking, as much as the documentary leaves us on a positive note, there is lots of work to still be done, and I think it's important that not only this story gets told and gets seen by a lot of eyes, both fresh and old, I guess, in this situation, but it helps to give this kind of exposure about the realities of women's football, and that it's not just what you see on TV or what you may perceive it to be. There's a lot more chaos and controversy that resides in women's sports than men's sport. And whilst there is a good silver lining with regards to the Spain national women's team, they're now being treated with more dignity and decency, with some more support from across the pond. Not from the men's team in particular, because there was a time when, during the controversy concerning Rubiales, the likes of Alvaro Morata were asked about what's going on, and they pretty much showed no support to the women. So obviously it's a national problem that needs to be dealt with on a holistic point. But again, there is support not only for the Spain national women's team because of the publicity they received because of winning the World Cup, but you gotta ask yourself, if they did win this World Cup, and let's say they crashed out in the knockouts or in the group stages, where would we be now? Would there have been the same groundswell of support? Would Rubiales have been kicked out? My answer to those things would be most likely not. And when you look at very similar situations in different nations, like Jamaica, for example, where they pretty much face the same issues of having a federation that doesn't care about them, despite them having some very good players, from Bunny Shaw to the Spencer sisters. There's no support for the reggae girls, for example. Hell, we can even go to Africa and Zambia, where there have been so many accusations of sexual indecency and assault leveled against their current head coach Bruce Mwape while he's their former coach. I think, sorry, memory is just a little bit blank, but regardless, he's still there in Zambia. There have been accusations leveled against him, and he's still there coaching. The current coach of Jamaica, he was convicted of sexual assault to one of his players, but he's still coaching. He's there right now. He's returned to the Jamaican setup, and that's just two high-profile cases that I know of off the top of my head, but there are more. They are much, much more across the board, and it's just that they're not receiving the necessary media attention to alert us, the public, to the issues that are transpiring at the moment. And because of that, we don't know about these stories for the most part, but they do exist. I mean, how many of you who are watching / listening to this video know that whilst Zambia were preparing for the Olympics this year, one of their players died during training? That's not public knowledge. That's not common knowledge. I don't even recall seeing some of the bigger women's football pages on social media talking about it, but it's something that happened, and there's next to no coverage about it. Just think of the trauma that these players have to deal with these kinds of situations, and the fact that it took, winning a World Cup for some of these issues to come to light. If Spain hadn't won that World Cup, where would we be right now? Would Spain be in a better situation? Would they still be performing the way they're currently performing at the moment? Or would they be in the same level / bracket with the likes of Zambia and Jamaica, for example, where there is potential, there are good players, but because of a lack of care and support from their respective federations, there's nothing going on? It's an interesting question to ask, and it is a question that has to be asked of so many federations across the board, across the world, when it comes to women's football. If you don't have any interest in supporting women's football, just don't start any programs around it. That's my perspective on it. Just leave it to the people who want to do it. If there are women in your country who want to play football and you see there's a general interest, not only from the public but from those who are interested in taking part, don't deny them the opportunity. Set something up, but make sure you're invested in it as much as they are. Otherwise, you're wasting your own time and resources, and you're wasting their own time and resources, which is unfortunately a situation that we find ourselves in when it comes to women's football. But anyway, that is pretty much um, my review of the documentary and the things that it brings to light. And again, overall, it's a very good documentary. If you are a follower of women's football, then of course you will be left with a lot of things to think about and to talk about um, in the aftermath of watching this documentary. If not, then at the same time, I'm sure you might be interested in watching women's football or learning a bit more about the stories of these players and other similar situations like the ones that I've mentioned. So, just if you haven't already, go give it a watch again. It's on Netflix. I'm sure if there's someone out there who's been brave enough already, and I'm sure YouTube won't care, it could be up on YouTube for all I know. But yeah, those are my thoughts on it. I'd like to hear yours if you've watched it, or now if after going through this 50 plus minute video you'll be interested in watching it, or if I've given you a good enough summary that you understand what pretty much happens. Just give me your thoughts on it in the comments below. Like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.